All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming out today. My name is Zach Snyder, and I'm the head of advisory here at Red Pepper. And if you haven't noticed, we've been putting a lot of energy and a lot of investment into our advisory program. And as part of that investment, I'm really excited to introduce David Futrell. David is an IO psychologist with a wealth of information to share in the EX space, and I'm sure you'll get a taste of that today. He's been an innovator at everywhere he's worked, most notably at big brands like Eli Lilly and Walmart, and we're really excited to have him as a part of our team. So with all that said, I'm really excited to introduce David Futrell.
Thank you, Zach. Well, I'm happy to be here. We're going to spend some time talking about retention and turnover and exits and how we measure those kinds of things. And uh, this is obviously a very complex topic, so we won't go super deep in any area, but I hope to uh, be able to give you a little bit of theory and ways to think about this topic and give you some very practical tips as far as what to measure, how to measure, when to measure, those kinds of things as we head through that. So the agenda that we're trying to get through is to essentially start with answering the question of why do employees decide to stay with or leave their jobs or their companies. Then we'll talk about different ways that we categorize exits and talk about them. Then we'll get into the topic of exit interviews versus exit surveys, what purposes they serve, whether they produce the same kind of information. Uh, Regretted versus non-regretted turnover, which turns out to be a little bit trickier than you might think to assess. Then we'll get a little bit more into the details of how I like to structure surveys. So just to give you a little bit about my background, Zach had mentioned I'm an IO psychologist. I started out at Saturn Corporation, the now defunct car company. When I was in grad school, I went there on an internship. After that, I did 6 years of external consulting that was really not directly in the IO space, but more in the process improvement and experimental design area. Then went to Eli Lilly, where I spent 16 years working with another IO psychologist on people analytics. We called our group workforce research. So we did everything related to measuring people and doing surveys. I won't say that we invented life cycle surveys, but we were very early into the idea of connecting information about the employee experience and engagement across the life cycle. I left there in 2014 and went to Walmart to run their employee selection strategy group. So every job uh, that you would get at a Walmart or Sam's Club or distribution center has a pre-employment test or assessment attached to it, and so that's what we built while we were there. And I left there about a year ago and started doing some work on my own. And Red Pepper is really well aligned with the kinds of things that I'm good at and like to do. So I'm happy to be taking this step. So uh, to move on into the actual content here, we'll talk first about instead of thinking about why people leave, let's turn that around and think a little bit about why people stay. And one of the metaphors or ways to talk about this that I found to be really effective is to think about instead of the relationship between an employee and an employer, think about personal relationships like, who your romantic partner or spouse is, and think about why don't you leave? So, we always have to think about these things. So what keeps you in a relationship? Well, there's a model that has been around since the I think since the 70s. Meyer and Allen created it, and they talk about commitment. And they think there are three flavors of why people stay in their relationship with their company, if you will. The first they call affective commitment. So this, if you want to go back to the relationship metaphor, it's like you stay in your relationship because you genuinely care about and love the person that you're with, and you enjoy being with them. So there's an emotional attachment there. Normative commitment is the kind of commitment you have because you feel a sense of obligation or a kind of a moral commitment. So you took your vow seriously for better or for worse. So even if it gets worse, then you'll still stick around because you're kind of wired that way. And then the one in the middle is continuance commitment. And so this it is more connected to the economic or rational reasons that you would stay in a relationship. So if you stay in because you take your because you love the person, that's affective. If you stay in the relationship because of this the vows that you took and the obligation you feel, that's normative. And if you stay in the relationship because you don't want to lose half your stuff, then that's continuance commitment. So that's a rational and economic kind of model. And when you think about the kinds of things employees might say or things that might become the basis of an item that you would use to measure it, I'll get some examples here. I'm not going to read through all of these, but an affective reason might be liking the people that you work with, liking your boss, and really feeling emotionally connected to the workplace. The continuance commitments are things are you don't want to leave because you've got a good salary that you can't easily replace, or may have a retention bonus or some sort of uh, distant vested stock options on the horizon. So that would cause you to stick around. And then normative is just things around uh, the company gave you a chance, so you want to fulfill your end of the bargain, if you want to think about it that way. Now, that third category of normative, this isn't something that you can manipulate. So whether someone has kind of this normative wiring is their wiring. This is more of a personality or values kind of variable. So when you're thinking about interventions for what you can do to keep people, you can't really do much with that one unless you want to select for it. You can select people who are more wired this way. But if you're dealing with your existing employee base, you can't do much with that. So you're kind of stuck with this affective and continuance. And we'll come back to that at the very end when we talk about the things that you can do to help improve retention. But the reason I wanted to bring it up now is it also helps us think through the kinds of things we ask on an exit survey or in an exit interview. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but one of the things that the research has shown is that obviously all three of these things do drive retention. That's what the whole model is about. But affective and normative also get us other good stuff. People who are higher on levels of that tend to be better at their jobs. They work harder. They treat other people well. They tend to be more engaged. When you are looking at continuance commitment as the outcomes there, it's like they do stay, but you get a slight negative relationship to some of the other things you want. So it's a reason to be careful with that lever, and that lever is also money. So it's expensive to base your retention strategy just on continuance commitment, although that's what a lot of HR groups want to do because it's easy. It's expensive, but it's easy to throw money at people to as a way to get them to stick around. So when we think about how we classify turnover, there are multiple ways that we can categorize it. But the three that are most often talked about are the around the who decided that this person was going to leave. So the involuntary versus voluntary turnover. This is not as easy as it looks either. And in many cases, if you've worked in HR, you'll know that there are people who left voluntarily with quotes around it. But the choice was you either leave now or we're going to help you leave at some point in the future. But the reason that we need to know this to at least some degree of accuracy is this is going to determine who we would send an exit survey to. It's really bad manners to fire someone and then send them a survey a month later and ask them why they left. So we want to avoid that. So we want to make sure that we have a coding system so that we can identify our exiting employees and send only the voluntary exits the survey. A second question we often ask is whether that exit was bad for the company. Now, obviously, not all turnover is dysfunctional. It's not a bad thing to lose a bad employee or a bad leader. So in some cases, we regret when people leave. In other cases, we don't care, or we even silently clap whenever they leave the company. Uh, so we'll talk about this again on the next slide. And then the third category is, was it preventable? Was this turnover that could have been avoided? Is something that the company or the manager or someone could have done to prevent the exit? And we'll talk about this more when we're thinking about how we structure an exit survey. So to move to the next slide and get into this regretted loss, one of the things that we did some really fascinating research on at Lilly was to look at this for a group of general managers for whom we had given uh, some pretty substantial retention bonuses and special stock grants and so on in order to keep them around. And when we examined the data, and this was like looking 5 years later, and had the several folks who knew all of these leaders really well that who had left, they only categorized about a third of them as being regretted. Uh, and when you think about it, these people were all folks that we loved so much that we gave them a whole bunch of money to not leave. And then only a third of them, after they eventually leave, do we actually care about. So it's important to keep that in mind and think about when you measure it. So it's like, many other things. We're very good at moving on, and things might be devastating in the moment when an employee leaves, but you find another employee, and sometimes they're better than the one who left. So part of the message here is don't fall too deeply in love with employees, because almost everyone is replaceable. And the other kind of lesson here is that when you measure, the regret part is critical. So if you really want to get at this in an accurate way, I suggest doing something like we have in the second bullet here, which is conduct an exercise for your employees each year. It can either be done as part of performance management, or if you do a potential assessment, that would be kind of a natural place to do it. But you would ask the question, what would the consequences be for the company if this person left, with the typical 2 weeks notice? How much pain would it cause us? Do we have a successor? On the other side of the coin, does that, if they left, would it actually create opportunities for someone else to grow? And you can expand that list. But the idea here is that you need to think about whether this would be a regretted loss before they actually tell you that they're leaving, because the whole emotional side of the situation changes once someone tells you they're leaving, and you may be trying to scramble to find a way to prevent that from happening. So when we get into answering the question of why did someone exit the company, there are a few ways that we can go about trying to determine that. So one way is to ask them face to face while they're still there. And we played around with this quite a bit at Lilly, and we also do this, or did this at Walmart for jobs. Is that you normally have some sort of exit interview. Now, in the old days, this used to be done by uh, an HR person who would, in many cases, it was the very last act that someone would go through before they walked out the door, is to have this interview with someone where they ask, among other things, it's like, well, why did you decide to leave the company? A second option is to ask them after they leave, which is an exit survey strategy, and we'll talk about the timing on those. And then the third is to use data and try to infer what is driving exit decisions by doing linkage research, linking it to other things. Now, these first two, we operate kind of at the individual level. It's really hard to infer why an individual left, but you can infer how, what tends to be drivers for your population as a whole through doing linkage research. So on the topic of exit interviews and exit surveys, exit interviews, and I'm talking about the things that we would do face to face normally before someone walks out the door. And there's nothing wrong with doing these exit interviews. And in fact, they can give you some information that you can't get in other ways. It's an open-ended uh, scenario. So the interviewer is able to ask and probe and so on if that person is willing to talk. And then you may learn things there that you need to take action on right away. So if you have, if that employee has a supervisor or a peer who is behaving unethically, then that would be something you'd want to know and take action on right away. So I'm not trying to discourage you from doing exit interviews, but in some ways, the surveys give us better information. Uh, One of the reasons that these things don't work all that well is something that psychologists call demand characteristics, and that has to do with the demands of the situation. So, if you think about it from the employee's perspective, they've already decided to leave. They've done their 2 weeks. They're getting ready to walk out the door, and the only thing standing between them and the sweet freedom of unemployment or moving on to their next job is this interview that they have to go through with HR. And in most cases, the person will tend to not give very specific reasons, and they're just trying to get out of the situation. So, what's the quickest way that I can get through this and get on with my life? Uh, and most people want to avoid confrontation and burning bridges. There's obviously exceptions. There's some people that will want to get everything off their chest right before they walk out the door. But generally, they try to avoid the confrontational scenarios. And one of the things that we learned, and I'm going to show you some data here, is that the results from the exit interview tend to not agree well with exit surveys that are done subsequently. Now, an important thing here is that we normally take the information that we get from this exit interview and we use that to classify the official reason for the exit that would actually go back into your HRIS system. Um, Now, up until, say, 10 years ago, these things were almost exclusively done by HR. But we've moved into kind of a new era now where we're letting software do a lot of what HR people used to do. And HR people love that, and HR people love Workday. And one of the reasons that they love it is because it takes some of their busy work and hands it to the supervisor. So one of and I've been through this and used the system myself with exiting employees, and it in most cases the supervisor is now classifying the reason for the exit. And when that happens, you can expect to not see very much data that tells you that the employee is quitting because they didn't like their supervisor. So the taking HR out of this process has not served us really well as far as getting more accurate data. I'm not convinced that it would have been that accurate anyway. But when you're thinking about this, make sure you know how your exits are getting coded and who is doing it, and whether or not you think you trust the way that they classify these. So I'm going to show you some data now. This was from Eli Lilly, and uh, we had exits, and we had them coded as a result of the interview they did, and this was with HR. And you can see the Pareto chart here. What you found is in the vast majority of cases, the reasons that exiting employees gave for their exit was either career options, which was something vague that, I found a better job or a different job, or personal reasons. Uh, so then you get a lot of other stuff, but those two are by far the most prevalent. When we took that data, and we did have this at the individual level, so we were able to link what an individual told us or how they were coded at the time of exit, and then sending an exit survey to that same individual, we could compare what people tell us a month later. I think at Lilly, and most of these were around 6 weeks after the exit that we would send the survey. And what we learned was that of those two categories that I just showed you, the career options, if you looked at the macro coding that we do in the exit survey, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, that about 70% of the people who said career options actually classified themselves as being dissatisfied with something about the company or the job, where only 23% of them said that they left because there was some opportunity that was too good for them to pass up. And you would expect that to be flipped. Uh, because career options doesn't sound like that you are unhappy. It just sounds like that you found something better. When you look at the personal reasons, you do get some more alignment here, where you've got 29% of those people actually said family and personal reasons in the exit survey, but almost twice as many said dissatisfied. So what you're really seeing is that when people are leaving the company and they're saying these two primary reasons, that you're missing the fact that there may have been something underlying there that you're not hearing. And then to take one deeper dive here. If we just look at the graph I just showed you in that red bucket. So these are people that said it was career options in the exit interview, and then they put themselves in that dissatisfied category on the exit survey. The top reason was limited advancement opportunities, followed by dissatisfaction with supervisor. So we've all heard that the old chestnut that employees don't leave companies, they leave supervisors. Uh, but until we started doing our exit survey and using kind of this methodology where we classify it in the way I'm going to show you in a moment, we never really saw that. People don't say that they're unhappy with their supervisor at the time that they leave. It came up very infrequently as a reason on the exit interview. So the exit survey was the way that we actually were able to dig into that a little bit. So again, exit interviews are fine, but don't expect them to give you the full picture. And one of the questions that I'm sure some of you are thinking is like, well, how do you know that the exit survey is more correct than the exit interview? And the real answer is, of course, I don't. But there's no reason for the person to lie whenever they're getting this exit survey. I mean, it's voluntary; they don't have to fill it out. There's not any reason I can think of that you would expect them to fabricate information in a big way at that point, where there is or are reasons for them to be vague at the time of the interview, as we talked about the demand characteristics of that situation. So moving on to exit surveys. So the content of a survey, I think that all of the things that I have listed here are things that you should try to include. I'm going to go into more detail on this macro and micro reasons in a moment. But I also like to take some of the engagement survey questions that we use, not all of them, because typically those things are at least, 40, 50 questions, but maybe take, 10 of what you think are your best questions and include those in the exit survey, and you're going to rewrite them into past tense. It's sometimes useful to know, what are they doing now, or what do they plan to do in the future? What company did they go to? Obviously, they don't have to answer these questions, but that can provide useful information. I always like to ask some open-ended questions there, like, what was there anything that we could have done that would have kept you from leaving? What did you like about this job? What did you hate about it? And then a closed-ended summary question or two or three, and with things like, if you had to do over again, would you have taken this job? And would you consider working for us again in the future? And this says the kind of the feel for an NPS style question, where whether you'd be willing to recommend that. I don't like NPS in an employee survey context, but because I think the recommendation part of it is a little weird when you're recommending a company, because that's going to be very dependent on the particular job and the person. But when you're asking the individual whether they would consider working there again, I think that's a perfectly fine summary question to ask in an exit survey. So switching gears, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail of how I structure exit surveys. This one, I took the branding off, but this is actually one from Walmart. I think it still runs exactly as I'm going to show you. If you really want to know, go get a job at Walmart and then voluntarily quit, and you'll get one of these surveys, and you can check it for yourself. But in that survey, what we ask is, why did you make the decision to leave? And when I first started doing these, I would force them to pick one, and it makes it cleaner and easier to analyze the data. But there are scenarios where people could pick, two or even all three of these things. They may have multiple reasons that they left. When we did this at Walmart and did the select all that apply, we found that you still have something around 80% of people that will only pick one. But if they pick two, then they will get the micro questions for that category. So what we ended up with there was, as the macro reasons are, were you dissatisfied with something about the job or the company? The second is, maybe I wasn't dissatisfied, but something just came along that was too good to pass up. So kind of being pulled away. And then the third is I left for a reason not related to the job or the company. Uh, at Lilly, we split this into two categories, and I'll show you some data on that in a moment. But I don't think that you have to do that. I think that this is a good way to do it. It makes it a little cleaner for the respondent. And the idea here is this is where we get at whether this was actionable. When thinking back to the slide earlier on the ways we categorize turnover, if they left for a reason that's not related to the job of the company, there's very little that you could do to prevent that. So these are the two categories where we really want to dig into the micro and get in an idea of why they really left. So what happens when you pick the first choice? So if you were dissatisfied, then it would branch and give you this list of micro reasons. So this was all programmed in Qualtrics. Qualtrics makes this very easy to set up a survey in this way. So if you ask this, then you get this question. And I've done this multiple ways, but the way that we did it there was that you could pick up to 3 reasons for that. I've also used ranking and said, like, what's your main reason, your second, your third? Either will work. So you could see all of the reasons that people might leave the company. Your list of reasons for your company may be a little bit different, but I'm sure that there's probably at least 70% overlap between this list and what you would end up using. If they pick the second bucket, which is I was presented with something I couldn't pass up, then these were the primary reasons that would kind of fall into the micros there. So more opportunities to be promoted, better work location, better compensation, and so on. And then if you picked the third bucket of reasons not related to your company, then you get into some of the things like retired, health reasons, wanted to stay with my kids, didn't go back to school, those kinds of things. And again, those are not particularly actionable, but it is interesting still to have some idea. Because I mean, if you think about it, some of these, with a lot of time and effort, you might be able to correct. If they decided they wanted to stay home with their kids, if you're already contemplating having on-site daycare in a company, then looking at these exit surveys and the data might give you an idea of whether there's any chance that might improve retention of people at least leaving for that particular reason. This is an example of the engagement survey questions that are rewritten in past tense. And it's nice to do these because then you can compare the people who left and how they answered these to the people who are still in the company, how they answer it, and people who are still in the company. And if you have an intent to leave question, you can compare the ones who say they're going to leave versus the ones who actually left. And that can give you some ideas for how you might model predicting turnover and identifying at-risk individuals. And then we asked, overall, what was your employment experience like? And then we had a couple of open-ended questions that you can see here. So this whole survey, it's well under 5 minutes for someone to answer. We delivered it via email to the employee's personal email, and the response rate was better than a third at Walmart. And this is with some very shaky personal email addresses. And then if you think about the population, a lot of these folks are young and don't look at their email all that often. So you could also consider delivering this via cell phone. And as most of you know, if you use Qualtrics, that delivering these things via mobile works just fine. So delivering it in that way might get you a better response rate for these groups. The one thing to keep in mind here while I'm on that topic is that if you're going to do exit surveys, you have to have a way to contact the person after they leave. So make sure you have either a personal email address, that may be something you collect as part of the exiting process, or a cell phone where you have a way to reach them. Otherwise, then you're doomed. You're going to have to find a way to do that. So this is from the Lilly data when we were doing our exit survey there. And as I mentioned, we had the 2 of the categories that were the uncontrollable or unavoidable things combined. But this is what we would always see with the data. We would see about 60% that were leaving because they were dissatisfied versus around 20 to 25% that would leave because of an opportunity too good to pass up. I often did an exercise when I would present this data, I wouldn't show them this. I would just tell them what the categories were, and then ask the leaders, whoever I was presenting this to guess or predict what percent of their exits were dissatisfied versus pulled out, an opportunity too good to pass up. And you will see that they will almost always reverse these. Most leaders think that people are being pulled out of their company, when the reality shows, or at least showed in the companies I've done this in, is that most people who quit are dissatisfied with something about the job or the company. And then once you've got the data categorized this way, then this is how we like to display it. We would kind of remind people of how big that chunk was, and then show them the specific reasons. And you see here that dissatisfaction with the supervisor was the number one reason that would pop up there. When you get into the one other thing on this slide, if you look at where compensation shows up, it's in the top half, but it's not a huge chunk. When people leave because they're unhappy with something about the job, it's more likely to be about their career opportunities, the job itself, or their boss, than it is about money. So people don't quit because they're unhappy with money, but if they're pulled out, it's always money. So the compensation package, as you see here, we had two different comp questions, which there's no need for, uh, is always the reason. So, the lesson here is, like, if you're trying to retain employees, you don't necessarily have to spend more money on them. But if you're trying to poach employees from other places, then money is always a big factor in doing so. Now, the third thing that we can do, this is separate from exit interviews or surveys, is to use our existing data and try to figure out if that gives us any information on why people leave. So one of the things that I like to do is to put an intent to leave or intent to stay question on my engagement survey, so that I can use that as a surrogate for actual exit behaviors. If you have been collecting data for a while, you can actually use the actual exits, because you'll have how your exited employees responded in their previous engagement surveys, and use that as an outcome variable. But you can correlate each individual question and scale on your engagement survey to against the exit behavior or the exit intent, and then you can do all kinds of cool stuff with that. And this is old school. These things look a lot better now, but you can always do something with a kind of a quadrant plot, where you would put the correlation with intent to leave or actual leaving behavior on the y-axis, and then the favorability or mean score on the engagement item there, and then kind of work from the upper left toward the lower right and identify the individual items which appear to have the strongest relationship with turnover or intent. And if those items are actionable, that can give you a good start on an action plan if what your goal is to reduce turnover. So in terms of making your whole process better, in terms of understanding retention and turnover, the first thing I would recommend is just having better measurement and ways to diagnose. We could spend a full hour just talking about the different ways to measure turnover. There are many ways to do it. I sometimes joke there's many ways to measure turnover, and they're all wrong. And they're all wrong because it depends on what you want to know. The most common way that you see turnover measured is the company just looks at their active headcount and looks at the number of people who left over the past 12 months, and that's the turnover rate. But it doesn't tell you anything about the when people leave. And people don't, your likelihood of leaving a company is not the same on day 2 as it is on day 1,002. So generally, you will see that people don't quit when they first start. Then they become more likely to quit. So the curve kind of has a peak, and that peak varies a lot. Retail jobs, the peak happens around 30 days. For white collar jobs, it may be 2 years. And then once you get past that peak, the longer they stay, the less likely that they are to leave. So it matters a lot when you're counting the bodies who are leaving and wanting to categorize those in a way that tells you when they're leaving. And for that reason, I'm a strong advocate for using survival analysis instead of or as a supplement to the normal way that you're the measuring turnover. A second thing I would do is I wouldn't get rid of exit interviews. I would do those, but I would also recommend always doing an exit survey process. It can give you great data. It's very inexpensive and pretty easy to implement a process like that. For the exit surveys, I'm sorry, exit interviews. What you want to do is to make sure that whoever's doing the exit interviews, which hopefully is an HR person, uh, that that they know how to ask questions and how to probe and try to really get at a root cause so that you can improve the accuracy of your coding at that point. And to develop a set of exit reason codes that is comprehensive and make sure that the employees know how to use the codes. Uh, at Walmart, and I believe similarly at Lilly, we had more than 70 exit reasons, and that's just too many. I think that you need to come down to a reasonable number, and just think about whether your actions would be different based on the code, so that that you get a list of codes that you can work with, and ideally, if they mirror what you put in the exit survey in some way, that makes it easier to do the comparisons between interview coding and what you learn in the survey. For the exit survey, I already mentioned, make sure you have a way to contact them. Send it out 30 to 60 days after exit. When we did it at Lilly, we did it a little bit longer than that. We started out doing this a long time ago, and we were actually doing it with mail, so it wasn't possible to get the surveys to people immediately. But I would wait long enough for them to have any bad taste washed out of their mouth from their experience, but you don't want to go so long that they no longer care or remember why they left. So the 30 to 60 days after exit, that range seems to work pretty well. And then I mentioned this before, but include at least one kind of intent to leave or stay item on your engagement survey, and you use that information to kind of help you diagnose. Use that as a surrogate. One other thing that I really like is to use onboarding surveys. One of the things that we've learned from doing research is that an employee's happiest day on the job is the first day, and it just gets worse after that. And so the learning what's happening early on can be very useful in driving your retention strategy. And we learned that many of the people who left can identify something that happened, very early in the first few weeks that said, "Oh, well, that's how things are going to work around here." So these early experiences are important, and having a good onboarding survey that you would do certainly like within the first month, it can be helpful in helping you figure out these exit reasons. And then, I mentioned some of this before, but when employees start, their first day is their happiest day. Their expectations are high. They're super happy, and then over time, either their satisfaction tends to drop, and their expectations may not drop accordingly. So, having this data and like understanding for your populations how those change over time can be very very useful. So the the one of the things we've learned just from doing this research is that there are some things that seem to be common across all companies. So if you don't have any data and you're trying to figure out what you should do to reduce turnover, uh, you think about two populations, which is, one are your brand new employees. And I mentioned the onboarding survey as a way to get at that. Another thing to think about is potential employees. So I've done a lot of work in my career with doing pre-employment testing. And one of the best ways to reduce turnover is to hire people who are less likely to leave. Now that requires a lot more effort than just doing surveys, but that early population and potential population is one that needs to be thought about a little bit differently than your existing employees. Most companies are more focused on keeping employees from leaving, so they're relying on that continuance commitment lever. And what that does is, a very common strategy is to do something like a retention bonus, where I give you a bunch of money, say $100,000, but you have to sign a paper that says, if I quit before the 2 years is up, or whatever the period is that you've established for the retention bonus, then you got to pay all or some of it back. So what you're doing there is you're putting the golden handcuffs on someone. You're not making them want to stay. You're just making it painful for them to leave, and that has some unfortunate the side effects. So instead of doing that, or in addition to doing that, consider creating engagement plans, which are focusing on understanding what individual employees actually want and make them want to stay. So having, really regular and effective career conversations can help with this. And, people change. They learn more about their companies and their jobs and their own values change. So you need to do this at least once a year to do that. But whether people want to stay or leave is an individual decision. So it's important that supervisors get good at this. And if not supervisors, then a mentor. But someone needs to be having these conversations, which we would use to kind of drive that affective commitment. And then finally, the focus. You can never go wrong with focusing on the supervisor. We promote people from individual contributor roles to supervisor roles, almost always based on how good they were at being an individual contributor. And this is a completely different skill set than what we're expecting them to do once they become supervisors. In some areas, like sales, it's not. You don't see quite the fallout rate that you do in areas like IT or engineering. Uh, because salespeople, having social and influence skills is part of their role. So the supervisor stuff comes a bit more naturally than it does for someone who is hired because they're really good at writing Python code. That doesn't, help you one bit uh, in in supervising your employees. So, find the right people to become supervisors, promote them there, and then train them and develop them and make sure that they're effective. If you have a way to measure their effectiveness, upward feedback is often something that can be helpful if you want to figure out something that you can actually measure in that. So I think that's everything that I wanted to talk about. So I'll take a pause here and be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Awesome. Well, thanks, David. And folks out there, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll be sure to get to them. But I did have a question right off the bat. Are there any good reasons not to do exit surveys? The value you discussed is certainly there, but I'm just wondering how an organization would evaluate, is it for us or not?
Well, there's really no good reason to not do it as long as you have a survey platform, and particularly if you're a company that already does, at least engagement kinds of surveys. So if you're kind of wired that way, then adding exit surveys as an extension to that just seems like a very natural thing to do. All you have to do it is the survey platform and a way to contact the employee after they leave. You can fully automate it, so that your system automatically knows when people who have left voluntarily hit the 30-day mark, and then they automatically get the survey, and it kind of runs itself. And that's the way we had structured it at Walmart. So and it's very inexpensive to do it. So I think that the cost versus benefit on this is pretty much a no-brainer. You're always going to learn something from doing this, and it's pretty easy and inexpensive to implement. So I can't think of any reasons to not do it.
Awesome. Thanks. Looks like we have a question from Rania. Can you share an example of item language you would use for intent to stay or intent to leave?
There's lots of items out there that you can use. The one that I prefer is to say, I am seriously considering leaving my company within the next 12 months. I prefer to frame it that way, where you're getting the person to think about whether they intend to leave, rather than saying something like, if I have my way, I will still be here in 12 months, which is another way to do it. And we've used that question before too. But you can get into the fist fights with IO psychologists arguing over like what's the right way to phrase the question. But that first item is the way that I prefer to do it, which is I am seriously considering leaving Walmart or Eli Lilly within the next 12 months.
Yep, that's great. And Qualtrics does have an alternate if you want to be able to benchmark against their EX25 database, but two great ways of getting at that. I have another question from Dana. What is a good response rate for an exit survey? Any tips on increasing response rates?
When we did this by mail at Lilly, we would often get, and we tracked it every month, more than 50% response rate. And this was when it was actually kind of harder to do because you actually had to open an envelope and fill out a Scantron form and then stuff it back into a business reply envelope, and things that most of you have never even heard of. And we would get 50% on that, and we were getting in the high 30s at Walmart with a much less conscientious population that we're leaving. So I think that if you can get it even above 25%, then it's still going to give you helpful information. You can't force people to respond to this. You have no influence over them whatsoever at that point. But in some ways, that makes that population more interesting because they have no reason to not give you accurate information.
Yeah, totally fair. Are there any levers you can pull? Creative wording, multiple, or sending through multiple channels, things like that?
Well, people don't like to be annoyed. I like to send one reminder, to folks and give them the chance to do this. But I like to avoid, trying to do incentives for these kinds of employee surveys because
Mhm.
I always fear that it's going to influence the response. It's like, I'm going to respond to this and maybe say nicer things about the company because they just gave me a $25 gift card or something to respond to the survey. So you could do that. I think that works better in the customer space than in the employee space. So, I would just try the normal things. One or two reminders, make it short and sweet. Tell them exactly why you're doing it, what you're going to do with the data, and then you get what you get.
Awesome. We have a question from Dendra. Are there any toolkits or suggestions for HR to use the data, best practices, etc.? I think this is getting at that feeling we all have when we pull all this data in and we scratch our heads and say, now what?
Well, that's a great question, and I've seen this happen multiple places. I'm sure Zach has seen it more than I have. But you'll get one or two people who are involved in setting up a survey and a subsequent dashboard to use it, and you build it the way that your clients said that they wanted it built, and then they won't look at it. So I think that you really need to get the customer involved and have them stay involved in this, and then keep following up. It's like, ask them. It's like, have you looked at this? And then it would be a mistake to not have a data analytics team or your data scientist or whomever monitoring this data, because the HR people and may get quickly bored with looking at this thing that doesn't seem to change very much. But if you have someone who's doing the analytics behind it and seeing something interesting and reporting on that, then that can perk up the interest. But I think designing good dashboards, but making sure that the clients actually are using it, and then if they're not using it, then find out why. But it's much harder to get people uh, to to look at exactly what they said they wanted to look at than I would have ever expected.
Totally fair. And yeah, having data is great, but you have to turn that into insights, and then you have to turn those insights into action. Those are things that have to happen in order to actually get value out of a program like this. And we here at Red Pepper are more than happy to lean in and help with those processes. Another question I had: what kind of linkages can be built between your engagement study and your exit interviews? You mentioned having some common questions. I'd love to know the utility of that and other best practices.
Well, one of the things that is fascinating is to look at uh, uh, even without the exit survey, just looking at the people who left the company, and then if you've collected engagement survey data and even onboarding, over time, look at their overall engagement trends and see how they change. So did something happen between year 3 and year 4, and then they left in the middle of year 4, so you can look at the things that are driving it. So that part is really it's a little challenging. You have to have decent data skills to be able to build the data set so that you can look at it within person and longitudinally. But I think that's really interesting. And then connecting that further to the exit survey reasons, and then seeing how those reasons and those macro categories connect back to what that person said in their earlier surveys. And obviously, another thing that you should be doing is not just looking at survey responses, but looking at demographics. Are things the same for women as for men? One of the things that we found is that this probably isn't surprising, but females are much more likely to pick that personal reasons category than men are. If someone's going to stay home with the kids, it's more or elder care, it's more likely to be the female than the male in those. So your interventions for these things may end up being different depending on the gender or the function. We found that we lost a lot of statisticians at Eli Lilly, and the reasons that they left were not the same as the reasons that sales reps left. So while I would avoid the complete fishing expedition where you try to just get a giant database and hope something comes out, being thoughtful and thinking through all of the things that might be related to propensity to turn over or when people turn over is always, I think, a good thing to do.
Yeah, it's so easy to forget that what we're doing here is at the core of it research, and hypothesis generation is so important to actually make sure you get something out of it rather than that spaghetti at the wall mentioned, everything that you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. If the main thing to take away is like think like a scientist. That's really the key to all of this stuff is like have an idea of like what's the mechanism of action. Why do people leave and when did they decide to leave and what were the reasons? But really be thoughtful about the what you're building. That will help you immensely in deciding what analysis to do and then how to present the data.
Awesome. I think that's a great closing thought to end on. So, David, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone too who are out there who joined.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers all.